Okay, hello all. Welcome to our virtual co-opting AI space at the Institute for Public Knowledge in New York City. Thank you all for being here. We're going to give you a minute or two to settle in and kick back over what is lunchtime here in New York. Welcome to Co-opting AI, which today will focus on climate. Now, over the past 2 weeks, we have been forced to witness a cruel and ruthless war of aggression against Ukraine, instigated by the Russian president. And I think it is important to acknowledge that before we delve into our conversation today. Casualties have tragically been mounting. We're seeing hundreds, thousands, if not millions of individuals fleeing, and Ukrainians, Russians, Europeans. The whole world, it seems, is yet again living with a fairly active threat of a nation invoking its nuclear arsenal. As a European myself, I'm acutely reminded, in fact, of the stories that I heard from my grandparents when they were fleeing west from the violence of World War II, as well as of my parents' stories about the painful East-West divide that was bolstered up by ideology, by economic disparities, and by a nuclear threat. And I sincerely hope that this atrocious war, my apologies, will end swiftly and that de-escalation and diplomacy will prevail. Now, as we continue to be shaken up by various emergencies of global scale, we sometimes lose sight of a disaster that has been building over decades and that we can no longer ignore: the climate emergency. Now, we often think about technology as a solution to many, many problems, the silver bullet that can help us halt the unimaginable damage and change to our socio-environmental world. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change, outlined that threat very clearly in their recently released report. But technologies, and artificial intelligence technologies specifically, are not climate neutral in the same way in which they're not politically neutral, social neutral, or value neutral. As a scaling technology, AI systems are in fact based on the very logic of extraction. Just to give you an example, a very powerful AI domain is natural language processing. I'm sure many of you have heard of this, which is the automatic manipulation of natural language, like speech and text by software, chatbots, autocorrect software. I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. Now, training a single large natural language processing model can have a significant impact on the environment. And we've known this for a while now. In 2019, researchers at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, analyzed various natural language processing models that were available online to estimate the energy cost in kilowatts required to train them, and converting this energy consumption into approximate carbon emissions and electricity costs. These researchers have estimated that, in fact, the carbon footprint of training a single big natural language processing model is the equivalent of 300,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions, which is in the order of 125 round trips between New York and Beijing. Now, with today's conversation, we want to turn to this dynamic, and we want to examine the relationship between AI, society, extraction, inequality, and the climate emergency. My name is Dr. Mona Sloane. I am a sociologist here at NYU and at the University of Tübingen. I am the convener of the Co-opting AI series. And before I hand over to my wonderful co-moderator today, Johnna Vitale, I want to acknowledge that I'm standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples, and that I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and the indigenous communities on whose land you may be located, and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Now, as I said, today I am joined by Jauna Vitale, who will be co-moderating, and I'm thrilled to welcome her. She is the Assistant Director of Sustainability at New York University, supporting the team in achieving sustainability goals across all NYU campuses, and we are a global university. Before joining NYU, Johnna worked for the Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation on multiple projects, including leading project management for NYCHA, the NYCHA Innovation Portfolio, and developing food equity programming. She also worked on recycling and organics outreach programming for the New York City Department of Sanitation, and developing green building operations and waste management training out of LaGuardia Community College for the Research Foundation at CUNY. Johnna has a Master's of Science in Environmental Technology and a bachelor degree in interdisciplinary studies from the New York Institute of Technology. Johnna, welcome, and I will hand over to you so you can introduce our wonderful panelists today. Thank you all.
Thank you for having me, Mona. I'm very excited to be here today to co-moderate with you. Hi all, my name is Johnna Vitale. I use she, her pronouns. As the Assistant Director of Sustainability at NYU, I work on multiple sustainability projects, including tracking our achievement of our 2025 and 2040 carbon goals, waste diversion, and co-chairing the Environmental and Racial Justice Network, or the ERJN. The ERJN focuses on the intersection between environmental and racial justice movements globally, including the disproportionate exposure of people of color to climate-related emergencies due to systemic racism. Technology and AI, by extension, has been described as having the potential to help people and save lives. That argument is certainly valid, but the question is really at what cost? In many societies, we see the technology in front of us and we don't wonder how it got there. We simply ask Alexa or Siri our many inquiries and never even consider how they came to be. Alexa, Siri, and other AI got here at great expense to other societies, ones that have been deemed less worthy often by white supremacist ideals. We have a responsibility to think beyond ourselves and the impact on our homes and our lives. Sustainability is global and climate change has a global impact. Our technology ventures should not come at the expense of others' livelihoods, homes, or health. Today we'll have two engaging speakers that will discuss this intricate relationship with AI. I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Zane Griffin Talley Cooper, a researcher and filmmaker who studies the social, political, and environmental relationships between data infrastructures, energy production, and resource extraction. He's currently a PhD candidate at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania and a doctoral fellow at the Center for Advanced Research on Global Communication. His work has appeared in journals such as Big Data and Society, and his multimodal scholarship has been exhibited at various festivals and museums. He's currently a lead researcher on an international project investigating e-waste supply chains funded by the Internet Society Foundation, for which he's conducting fieldwork on rare earth mining in South Greenland. Our second speaker is Victor Galaz, and he's an associate professor in political science, the deputy director of the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and program director of the Beijer Institute's Governance, Technology, and Complexity program. He's also co-editor-in-chief for the journal Current Opinion in Environmental Sustainability, or COSUST, and board member of the Swedish International Development Corporation Agency, or SIDA, since 2021. His research explores the political and governance challenges created by rapid global change, including globally networked risks, governance dimensions of planetary boundaries, the interplay between financial systems and Earth system dynamics, and the sustainability implications of novel technologies. Galaz's work in societal challenges created by technological change includes governance dimensions of geoengineering, early warning systems of epidemic outbreaks, uses of social media to detect ecological change, online mis- and disinformation on environmental issues, and sustainability risks embedded in early applications of artificial intelligence. He is currently working on the book Dark Machines for Routledge about the impacts of artificial intelligence, digitalization, and automation of the biosphere. He also coordinates the new initiative AI, People and Planet, together with the Beijer Institute of Ecological Economics. Thank you both for being here. And Zane, we welcome you to the stage.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here and to be able to speak with you all. I, too, am speaking from the unceded lands of the Lenape people down here in Philadelphia. And what I'm going to be talking about today has a lot to do with the relationship between AI and land. So I'm going to be talking about my talk. I'm calling AI in the data energy resource matrix, and this is the first time I'm talking about this sort of theoretical framework that I'm developing to help me to understand the relationships between my my two sites of study and my dissertation project. I look and so I'm going to start with this excuse me, this provocation, which is, where is AI? And this is a very complicated question to answer because you know, I'm talking today pretty specifically about AI infrastructure. I'm not necessarily talking about how AI is applied in, you know, various other settings like policing and, you know, things like that. I'm focusing pretty specifically on the material infrastructure of AI. And so in thinking about where it is, this is a multifaceted question that invokes a lot of different spaces. And so in my work, I'm focused pretty specifically on the Arctic and in Iceland and Greenland, respectively. So I focus on cryptocurrency mining, the cryptocurrency mining industry in Iceland, which is very quickly shifting to more of an AI and high performance computing forward agenda, where Iceland's data center industry sort of grew out of its involvement in the cryptocurrency mining industry, but now that infrastructure is sort of shifting towards more AI and machine learning, high performance computing applications, because the infrastructures for these two things are very similar. They look very similar. They have similar types of organizations on the ground. So like the way that these infrastructures are shifting makes a lot of sense. And so in thinking, but Iceland is invoking this idea of nature, of emptiness, of the Arctic being this empty space full of abundant energy, as this sort of natural place for where data and where data centers like should be. And also on the other hand, just a short 3-hour plane ride away to the west, we have Greenland, which is sort of opening into this mineral frontier of sorts, where all sorts of international mining companies are clawing at the bit to gain access to Greenland's seemingly untold mineral wealth. And these mining companies and mining ventures are using a lot of the same sort of aesthetics to advertise their mining ventures as future thinking, as necessary for digital and renewable and sustainable futures. And so in all of these, in both of these spaces, we can see an invocation of nature, of emptiness, and of energy abundance to frame these Arctic spaces as what Alex Johnson would call a natural home for data futures, but also the natural place from which minerals for these futures will be extracted. So already here we have these really complicated spatial entanglements when we're talking about where AI is, because AI is at the place where these data centers are, but it's also involved and enrolled in these spaces of extraction as well. And so, which brings me to this question of AI's carbon footprint. Now, Dr. Sloane talked about this study, which I'm glad, it was like a great little intro to my talk here, where training a single AI model can emit as much carbon as 5 cars in their lifetimes. AI's carbon footprint problem, another study in July 2020. So we're talking about all of the energy and carbon that training these natural language processors create, but also at the same time, we have these studies like actually Google said just a couple of weeks ago, good news, everybody. Actually, all of these studies are wrong, and AI doesn't actually emit that much carbon. Machine learning is fine, everybody, according to Google. Also a study last year, what was it, 2 years ago now? I don't know. Time is strange in the pandemic, but that the data center energy use, aggregate energy use, has plateaued actually in regards to efficiency, and that growing efficiency inside data centers will make energy use better, and it's fine. So like data center energy use and carbon emissions, it's all going to be fine. Well, I think that what I'm talking about is that I think that focusing on the carbon footprint, it might not be the right way to talk about AI's impact on the environment. We need to be thinking a little bit more systemically and a little bit more about the relationships involved, which brings me to this brilliant work of art by Kate Crawford and Bladen Jolet in that I'm sure a lot of you have seen. I've taught it a number of times, and it's just a fantastic piece that breaks down sort of all of the infrastructures, extractive infrastructures, operational infrastructures to deal with discard that are involved in the building, maintenance, operation, and discard of an Amazon Echo. And this is a great sort of more systemic way of thinking about these relationships. But my critique of it is that it's object-centered, right? So we're seeing this system through the point of view of an Amazon Echo, and its journey, while this is like a very complicated and complex diagram, it's actually fairly linear. If you look at the journey, it starts in the earth over here on the left side, and then it moves through this extractive phase. Here in operation, we see, it's all of the data centers involved, and the labor and everything like that. And then it moves over here into the discard phase, and then it's back to the earth again. So it's from earth to earth. And what we're seeing is largely a linear process. But what I've been seeing in my fieldwork in Iceland and Greenland is that these processes aren't that linear, and they can't really be forced into these linear relationships from one place to another, to another, to another. And so what I've been trying to think about to help me sort of organize the way that these spaces relate to each other is this thing that I'm calling the data energy resource matrix. And it's basically just another way of thinking about how computing infrastructures are situated in sort of a larger situation of action. So like I'm building off of Adele Clark's method of situational analysis to sort of think about this and map this situation. So we have data infrastructures, energy, and resource extraction. They're all sort of indirectly related and entangled with each other in this space. But they rest on top of this same sort of, they rest on top of the same thing, the same process, and that is labor. So what I'm trying to accentuate in this model is to put people at the center of this model, because in a lot of these ways of thinking about AI and its impact on the environment, there isn't a tremendous amount of focus on the people involved sometimes. And I feel like labor should be more central to thinking about this. And so what I am proposing here in this provocation is that labor should be front and center, because the labor required to build and maintain data infrastructures is related to the labor required to build and maintain energy infrastructures, which is also related to the labor required to build and maintain infrastructures for resource extraction. So all of this labor is stitched together in ways that currently are sort of invisible, but should be brought into the light, because like because this whole system is sort of bounded, right? So labor is the foundation, but the system is bounded, controlled, shaped, moved, and managed by networks of power and capital. So in thinking of the system like this, it's a little bit different than Crawford and Joly's way of breaking down the anatomy of an AI system, because it's not really object centered. It's relation centered. So AI as a system exists somewhere in this matrix. It's a product and articulation of these relations. And these relations, they're not linear. They don't follow like a supply chain sort of logic. They fold back into and onto each other in various ways. They're not even traditionally cyclical, like a life cycle analysis doesn't necessarily map onto this quite well enough. But what I'm trying to do here, hopefully successfully, maybe we'll see, is to put forward a relation-centered way of thinking about this. And so thinking about relations versus objects, because AI does begin, end, and begin again in the earth. But in order to bring it out of the earth and put it back in, people are involved at every stage of this process. And power and capital bind it. So we can see in Greenland, of the 125 or so new mineral licenses, new exploration licenses that have been filed in the last 7-8 years, one or two is for companies owned by Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Michael Bloomberg, all of the big US oligarchs that are using mining companies that use artificial intelligence and machine learning to locate new ore deposits that are then going to become minerals that get folded back into the AI system in this giant like sort of feedback loop, right? But at the center of all this, undergirding it is also labor. And in Greenland, there's a significant activist contingent that has worked tirelessly for the past decade to fight these relations, to make these relations better. And in April of 2021, they forced a snap election, which upended the entire government. And now there's a new progressive government that is trying to sort of rethink the relations between the Greenlandic people, their nature, and the extraction that seemed all but certain and imminent, but now is not. And so I guess I want to end by saying that in our thinking about the ecological impacts of AI, people and communities should remain central to these analyses. This was a celebration after the election. Oh yeah, I'll just end there. We don't have to watch the whole thing.
Thanks, Zane. Actually, that was pretty lovely. You touched on some interesting points in your presentation, and we look forward to discussing more. But right now, we want to bring Victor to the stage.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join you today, and thanks, Zane, for a really good introduction to the topic. I'm going to add my perspective to this, coming a little bit more from the climate change and ecology type of community. And I think just as a background, I think what's the main issue? How do we talk about AI? You brought that up, Zane. And I think one of the main problems that I see after studying this for a while is that people tend to look at AI and how we can use AI to address climate change as some sort of puzzle solving type of thing, right? So you have an AI system and then you put it into an energy system and then you optimize something and then you reduce energy efficiency, or you put it into agriculture or digital farming and then you optimize water use, etc. I think it's a very limited way to look at how AI is connected to climate change and how our planet is changing. You probably have seen this before in various versions, but just the way I look at this and how I'm looking at planetary change. So this just shows temperature changes on planet Earth going all the way back 60 million years ago. And of course, the climate has changed over time on planet Earth, and it has shifted. One of the main things that we always talk about in our community is the fact that something happens around 10,000 years ago in the mid-Holocene, which is an unusually stable phase in the history of planet Earth that has allowed humans as a species and civilizations to flourish. I mean, that's the whole point. So the whole basis for everything we have created, democracies and arts and science, etc., builds on that stability. The challenge is, of course, if you follow the work of climate scientists and the IPCC, etc., is that we're moving very, very rapidly out from that stable phase. And that has big implications. And of course, what does it mean whenever we talk about AI and climate change in this very, very rapidly changing planetary context? The way I tend to look at it is in this way. So to me, the reason why I think climate change is important is because we have something called a biosphere. So the biosphere is the sum of all life on planet, both human and non-human life. So ecosystems and oceans and forests, etc. Without a biosphere, we would just be, planet Earth would just be a dead rock floating around on space. What is interesting here is that we, on top of this biosphere, have created what some people call the technosphere, the sum of all infrastructure and technologies shaping the biosphere at the very profound levels, as you also illustrated, Zane. The challenge and the fascination and the responsibility that people developing these technologies have is huge, right? So there are some very rough estimates about the size of the technosphere on planet, which is around 30 trillion tons. And if you spread that around on every square meter on planet Earth, that's 50 kilos of infrastructure that we have on planet Earth. So massive, massive amounts of modifications of our planet and the planetary system. What I see as intriguing and challenging in this space, whenever we talk about artificial intelligence or machine intelligence, is that we are, through technological development, making this infrastructure increasingly what some people say cognitive. So through sensors and data analysis and Internet of Things, etc., this infrastructure becomes able to communicate and cognitive. And this is very, very connected to artificial intelligence. So, and essentially the technosphere is going to shape, has shaped, and will continue to shape our future on this planet, all life, both human and non-human life. This was also mentioned in the opening, is that some of these changes in terms of artificial intelligence entering into our lives are not going to be visible for us always. So at some point, some colleagues here in Stockholm, Emma Engström and Pontus, call this infusion. So they looked at essentially how this invisible infusion of AI just moves into technologies in a way that we don't always see. So in this particular case, Instagram, 2018, when you had Instagram, of course, you didn't think about how your newsfeed was filtered and in 2019, they implemented a deep learning AI system. I assume that people didn't even notice. So this invisible infusion, and this is happening in many types of technologies. So in this context of rapid planetary change, technological change happening in parallel, of course, there will be an interest by the private sector, from policymakers, civil society, and NGOs to use these technologies in a way that helps us cope with the planetary crises. I mean, it's becoming increasingly obvious. I think we're seeing more and more evidence that countries such as China are advancing, for example, digital farming, not because they're interested in the technology, but forced by the necessity of increasing pressures on limited resources. So it's not only something that's being supplied by innovation, it's also a perceived need of coping with a rapidly changing environmental context and scarcity of resources. One thing that I find intriguing, and again, going back to my first observation, that I think that we're talking about AI in the wrong way, as some sort of puzzle solving where you put one AI system to optimize one little thing in infrastructure, is that the impacts on climate and sustainability, I think, will be broad of AI. So it's going to impact essentially all sectors that have relevance for sustainability, whether we talk about financial services or education, environmental monitoring, farming, forestry, ocean management, etc. I mean, we're seeing this already. We mapped this in a paper. It will be ubiquitous. I mean, in terms of what I mentioned in fusion, it will be almost invisible. And then the third point, which is much more challenging, I think the impacts of AI and climate change and sustainability is going to be deep as well. So that means that these technologies are going and are already now starting to shape the way that we look at the world, the way that we communicate with each other, the way that we look at nature and perceive the climate crisis. Also connecting to our deep emotional world. I mean, that's a longer point. I'm going to skip that, but we can elaborate that more if you want to. A couple of points that I think are important, and this is just going to be maybe some sort of provocation or summary of what I think is important whenever we talk about the connection between AI, climate change, and changes in the planetary system. I think what we're seeing now and the deployment of AI technologies is that these technologies are currently optimizing for fragility. And by that, I mean that living systems such as ecosystems, forests, agro-ecosystems, the oceans are living systems. And whenever you optimize and remove redundancies and you promote efficiency, actually you're making them more fragile to change. That's a deep, deep insight from ecology, that whenever you promote monocultures instead of having a diverse landscape, those landscapes become much more efficient in providing one particular crop, for example, but those systems are much more vulnerable to change whenever you have a pest outbreak or extreme events, etc. And we're seeing this across the whole span of ecosystems that we depend on. AI is very likely to just accelerate that trend of simplifying these living systems. And when I talk about diversity, I'm not only talking about biodiversity, I'm also talking about diversity in terms of knowledge systems that are managing or a landscape or being stewards of a landscape. You're replacing local deep knowledge of a particular ecosystems with something that's automated and built on data analysis, for example, and that removes diversity of knowledge and skills. The other aspect that I think, and also based on observation following this domain, is that we really need to move away from the mentality of, hey, I have a super nice AI application for this climate thing, to take one step back and start to assess the more systemic impacts of these experiments that we're deploying at the moment, whether they are in digital forestry or digital farming or weather services that apply deep learning algorithms to predict what's happening in the next months. I think we're getting to that stage where we need to move away from these nice examples to assess them much more critically. And the last point is that what I see engaging with this sector and the tech sector and the way that policymakers talk about AI and the climate challenge, there's a massive ingenuity gap. Ingenuity gap is a term created by Thomas Homer Dixon, in case you're interested in his book from the 2000. But the scale and the accelerated challenges that we're facing here are not, those are not the challenges being addressed at the moment by people developing AI for the climate. I think what they're missing now are three things. I think that type of AI innovation or applications, they're missing a clear direction. So direction meaning we need to decarbonize as quickly as possible. We need to protect natural systems and ecosystems, and we need to make it in a way that doesn't create inequalities. So that direction is missing now. The other thing is that we need these types, of innovations that promote instead of remove diversity. I don't hear that discussion whenever companies or policymakers talk about the next AI system to optimize crop production, for example. And then the last point, which has to do with equity, of course, distributional impacts of these technologies, to look at them seriously and prevent harm in a proactive way, and trace that and track that development over time whenever you develop these technologies. So to me, these would be my three key things that I worry about, that we're using AI to optimize fragility. We're just promoting nice pilot projects, but we're not assessing the systematic long-term impacts and the huge gap in what needs to be done and what is currently being done in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. And now we're going to move into the panel discussion portion of our agenda today. Thank you both again for being here and for sharing your perspectives. My first question, talking about the labor focus, fragility, ingenuity gap. Won't a lot of these conversations be happening in away from the public? So who's going to be involved in these discussions, or who do you envision is going to be involved in these discussions to change the shape of how the trajectory that we're currently on, right, where it's away from the public, and how are you going to get the right stakeholders in the room?
Was that to me?
It's to both of you, considering both the labor approach and considering the ingenuity gap and the fragility and the different items that you mentioned in your summary, Victor. So whoever can go first.
Yeah, you can lead it off, Victor.
Okay, sure. I mean, I think that's a very important observation. And I think these conversations are happening and should happen at different levels. So it's both at policy making level, but also on the ground. And I think we've seen a couple of interesting examples, for example, in applications of data-driven farming, that's not something that has to be done by big tech. That's actually something that can be done in collaboration with local farmers and a local university, for example, where you combine data analysis with local knowledge and local interest. So it's doable, but I would say that that's a minority of how this type of innovation is being implemented at the moment.
Anything to add, Zane?
Yeah. I agree that I think this conversation should be happening on multiple levels and in multiple venues. But I think in my estimation, I think that we need to sort of reassess and maybe expand what is meant by the term stakeholder, and like who are the stakeholders in this system. And I think that the term stakeholder can apply to a whole number of different folks that are involved in all sorts of different levels. Like I'm organizing in Greenland, for example. Like I've been talking a lot with the activists there, trying to get a sense on how they view the future of Greenland in regards to mining and extraction and relationships with and their relations with nature and things like that. But like I don't speak with these people necessarily about the future of like AI or anything, even though this community is inextricably bound to these futures. There is not necessarily a wide consciousness that they are stakeholders in these futures, but they are, right? And so I think that the conversation needs to expand. And this is sort of what I'm trying to address with this, trying to get away from this object-centered approach to this relation-centered approach. Who is enrolled in these relations, and how can we attend to all of these different people, spaces, and ecologies that are enrolled in these processes, and how can we bring them into the fold as stakeholders, because they absolutely are. And so, like, you know, I've in the project that I'm working on, I've started to try to do this in a way. I'm bringing together activists from Greenland, from the Thacker Pass area in Nevada, where there's a lot of lithium mining, and Chile, to talk across these spaces about how imaginaries for the future of renewable energy and digital technology is affecting these spaces and bringing these people in as stakeholders. And I just think that that communities like this need to be able to see themselves as stakeholders in these futures. I don't know. I'll stop there because I'm rambling. But
oh, absolutely,
yeah.
That's exactly what I was getting at, because
Yeah.
what we typically see in this is the people who are most impacted directly are not at the table.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that a lot of conversations that I've had, you know, with activists and with the community, is about how to get them to the table. And I know there, in some areas, you know, you're talking about the election, they're hoping to vote for someone that can kind of help sway and bring their word up, but that doesn't always happen because of a plethora of reasons. So thank you for delving into that a little bit. My second question, and after this, I'll pass it over to Mona to take questions from the audience. It's about the concept of the idea that the land itself has rights. The river has the right to flow. The mountain has the right to stand, right? So thinking of that concept, you know, talking about the natural home, Zane, I'm going to start with you, the natural home for data centers. How do you think that jives with the idea that the land itself has rights, aside from the labor and the people?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that I do think that the land itself has rights. And that's something that I think is very interestingly and importantly being addressed in Greenland right now. And like this new government, like this, so the snap election happened last April in direct response to this this rare earth mine that is supposed to go online near this small town called Narsok in South Greenland. I don't know why but anyway, these activists organized around this progressive political party and were able to exert like enough political will and pressure to upend the whole government to sort of change the conversation around what Greenland's future should be and how it should relate to resource extraction, and how the agency of their nature should be included in these political platforms. And like one pretty dominant theme around this, and especially the location of this mine in particular, is it's the location of a specific type of rock that is very special and almost sacred to communities in South Greenland, called Tuktopeat, which is not found anywhere else. And a lot of folks in the community go out and dig for this rock, make jewelry and all sorts of things of it. And you know, there are stories about how it was, you know, stories, myths, and legends about how it was created. And and it's a special mineral that would be completely obliterated if this mine were to go into effect. And so there's a lot of conversation around the right to, the right of the land to, in the agency of nature to exist and thrive. And I think we're in Greenland right now, we're seeing the conversations about this happen at the, at the parliament level, and it's very interesting.
Thank you, Zane. And similarly, Victor, I want to bring that question over to you in a slightly different format, thinking of the idea that nature has its own rights, but you're also saying that, this is going to happen, is what I'm taking from your presentation. So how do you reconcile those two things and, maybe the lawsuits that might come up as people try to defend the land?
I think that it's a challenge to reconcile those, to be honest. The way I talk about it and my colleagues talk about it would be stewardship of a landscape or an ecosystem, which is something different than protecting. It's being an active steward for future generations. So to me, especially in a context where we have transformed these systems for so deeply in the last decades, like these landscapes are not pure nature in many regards. They have been shaped by humans for a very long time. And again, connecting, so the question for me, again, connecting to the IPCC and the work and the challenges we're facing, to me is how do we create what they call climate resilient development for all in ways that we become clever stewards of natural systems at the same time as the climate is changing very rapidly. That to me is the key question. And whether the right of land fits into that, I'm not sure. I don't know, to be honest.
Okay, thank you both. I'm going to pass it over to Mona to take some questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and thank you enormously to Zane and Victor for your really thought-provoking contributions. I have the honor of bringing in the audience by way of Q&A chat box, and I want to kind of stay with the topic of policy for a little bit and direct the first question at you, Victor, and then maybe Zane, you can chime in too. We have a question about the war in Ukraine, and the question is, or the statement is, the war in Ukraine is already causing world leaders to call for more fossil fuel production. How do we reframe the need to curb climate change in the light of these developments? Very important question, Victor. Maybe you can go first.
Yeah, I can. I'm not totally sure whether I can connect this to AI in any sense, but I'll give it a try. I think actually the call for more fossil fuels, my understanding is mostly in the US. I think what we're seeing in Europe is an accelerated ambition to boost renewable energy over fossil fuels as part of a security ambition to decouple from Russian fossil fuels. I think that's what we're seeing. I think that accelerated ambition is good. I think it's timely. We should have done it before. But I also worry, and that's a lengthier discussion, of starting to talk about climate in security terms. That securitization is called in some terms, could lead to unexpected consequences that we talk about climate change as a security issue, about protecting borders, about boosting defense budgets rather than human security issues, dealing with poverty and fragility and vulnerability around the world, which is something different from a security perspective. So that would be my take on that.
Yeah, just building off of that, I mean, I think I agree that that a lot of these calls for boosting fossil fuel production are coming from the US, but the EU also just, if I'm not mistaken, said that they are all in on an all of the above strategy, where we're incorporating renewable energy, but also making sure to boost natural gas and other things as well. So like this, all of the above way of talking about it worries me. And to me, it comes down to again this question of relations and how we have and how all of this is predicated on sort of the conditions that the conditions that we have sort of built up and are forced to live with. Like, you know, we are talking about what we're talking about is transitioning to a new energy regime, but continuing to increase energy use because capitalism requires constant growth. But what we should be talking about is new ways of relating to new ways of thinking about our relationship to energy, so that we can not only transition to a renewable energy system, but to ultimately decrease our total energy use and think about energy and our relationship to it in different, more sustainable ways. So I don't know. It's a tough question, but that's my sort of botched answer to it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's probably also a question we have to continue to grapple with, and that kind of, as you both said, is more acutely shored up now. Victoria said urgency is a good thing. So we will have to see how this unfolds. I have another question I want to bring to you, which is about stakeholder interests, and I want to kind of rephrase it a little bit to make it specific to the tech industry. So the question is, or the statement is, I should say, there seems to be a corporate movement toward stakeholder interests, and let's stipulate in the tech industry for the sake of this conversation. Now, do you see that as actually happening, or is this just a facade for business as usual? From your expertise and scholarship, and maybe Victor, we can hear from you first on this as well.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I mean, if we talk about the tech sector in this context, right? I think we're seeing some of that. So if we talk about responsible AI frameworks or AI ethics frameworks that have some component of stakeholder engagement, I think that some companies are ahead of others in that regard. But in general, I don't think it will be enough at all. I think there is a need to move beyond these voluntary frameworks to have regulation, which is typical for me to say as a political scientist. But I think there is a big risk, and you see that in general. That's not just for the tech sector. It could be for fisheries or in the mining sector or whatever, that some companies might have more ambitious policy, but others do not. And essentially that undermines the whole ambitions of the whole sector. So you need something that makes sure that all follow and abide to the same rules. So regulation and legal frameworks are key in that regard. So it's not going to be enough as it is now.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that strong regulation and legal frameworks are definitely needed. And like I said before, I'll just reiterate that I think that that there needs to be sort of a reassessment and an expansion of what we mean by stakeholders and who the stakeholders are in these systems, and sort of an analysis and attention to the hierarchies of power in these systems, and how they work and how they affect these different groups of stakeholders. So yeah, I guess, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that. I have a few more, and then I have one myself. So I'm gonna turn towards more practical matters, as it were, with this one. And Victor, this one I think is for you, and I have a different one after that for you, Zane. So we have a question around any frameworks perhaps that companies or investors use to incorporate climate impact in AI, into digital or data infrastructure investments, or any other practical tools that you are aware of to help companies, so the corporate actors specifically, think about their footprint and impact. Victor, anything that you know of?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are. I think there are interesting examples. I think one of the more ambitious ones would be something called the science-based targets, and some tech companies have signed up to that. One of the challenges I see in this particular space when we talk about AI and climate is the fact that companies are aligning their commercial interest with climate change work, right? So where you have data, lots of data, where there is money to be saved, you will see applications of AI. It makes sense for a company to mobilize in that way and to promote it. It's something good that they're doing. But there are a bunch of other things that just fall between gaps, things that don't have a clear commercial interest, or where there is data missing, where we will not be seeing that type of action. So, for example, we're not seeing AI innovation for ocean acidification, even though ocean acidification is a huge problem and will affect millions of people around the world and threaten their food security. There's no AI innovation because the data is missing. There's very limited data that you can train AI systems on, and there are very few commercial incentives to move into that space. So that, to me, is going to be the challenge. So the good frameworks, but the big gaps as well at the same time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the two sides of the same coin take that you shared here. Zane, one for you, briefly, before I have 1.5 more before I close this off. Are you concerned that the interests of communities affected by rare earth mining could be used to maintain that fossil fuel status quo? And are there measures we could take collectively to prevent that from happening?
Yes, this is a really good question. And this is something that the right has actually been harping on a lot, that that renewable energies require this vast, like all of this new extraction, especially of rare earth minerals and like cobalt and all of this stuff, and that we'll have to embark on all of this new mining, and it's going to upend communities around the world, and that fossil fuels are much cleaner in this regard. Like this is a critique that is happening all over the right in regards to energy transitions. And like I think that that these types of issues are being used to critique the space and to encourage that we stay on the fossil fuel train. But I think that it also offers us this transition offers us, energy transition offers us a great opportunity to think harder and more constructively about our relationship to things like reuse and recycling and the longevity of like devices and things. Like we don't necessarily need all of this new mining. All of these, like these international mining companies are trying to convince us that we need all of this new mining to keep up, but like that's not necessarily the case if we focus on reuse, recycling, because we, with all of the rare earth, for example, rare earth materials that are out there right now, we could make a better effort to recycle and reuse. But tech companies like Apple, for example, I mean, just this year they started allowing third-party repair. So like we need to start talking more about cultures of maintenance, repair, care, recycling, and I think if we can sort of reorient our relationships to these ideas, that the question of mining will become slightly less important. Like we're still going to need some mining to happen. Like that's just not going to go away. But we should think, I think this provide, and like Theoria Francos is doing a lot of great work in this area too, in regards to lithium mining and the rise of green capitalism. I think that we need to rethink and sort of question and critique what sustainability means in these certain spaces, and how to sort of reframe our thinking on it. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm asking this last question, and we're out of time now, but I want to get this in. And so I'm asking for a one sentence answer from each of you. And I'm going to take a cue from an audience question, which is about the question, how do we get more people outside of academia and tech interested in the significance of AI ethics from a climate change perspective without demonizing them as consumers or keeping and how can we keep big corporations accountable? I'm gonna tweak that slightly to ask, what would you want to see continued? What quote unquote works in the space of AI and addressing the climate emergency? So instead of focusing on breakages, let's focus on linkages for this very last question before I close this off. Victor, one sentence.
I wouldn't focus on people. I would focus on investors, people's with equity and investments in companies. Those have much bigger influence than we think. And I think if you manage to get those moving, that would have big system impacts. And then consumers will follow. So I would start there instead of consumers.
Following that, I agree in principle, and I'm going to say my answer is going to be somewhat different. I think that we need to. I think that in order to bring the public more into this and bring folks outside of academia into this, I feel like we need to shoot, this is longer than one sentence. Like there's a rising awareness that computing is a material thing. And I think that is great. And what we need to do is continue to demystify the language around these infrastructures to make them more familiar, so that we can continue to address them at a systemic level. Hopefully.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
Thank you both. And with that, I want to close this off with a statement that is also from the audience. And I want to acknowledge that. I think it's a really fitting closing statement, which says, can't we or shouldn't we ask in an attempt to connect the topic of the Ukraine war with the future of climate change and AI? What global policy actions are required to prevent mineral-rich regions from becoming new conflict zones in the future? And I think that is a wonderful question that we can all take. I want to thank sincerely Johnna Vitale for co-hosting the conversation on co-opting AI today. Thank you. Thank you, Zane Cooper and Victor Galaz, for your thought-provoking and extremely relevant and important contributions to the conversation. My gratitude to all of you as well as to the team, and of course you, the audience, for joining us today. Please come back. We will have our next Co-opting AI event on March 24th on Co-opting AI photography. And with that, have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay healthy, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.